Hey everyone, this is a conversation with Dr. Ronald Feinman, a historian, author, and professor. I was lucky enough to take Dr. Feinman's class back in college, and it's one of the courses that has most stuck with me over the years. A lot of the assignments I did in his class actually became the scripts for my earliest videos, so I'm really excited to have him on today. I think he has a very interesting perspective as someone who's been in the trenches not only as an educator, but also as a historian, going through the files and doing the first-hand research without which my work wouldn't be possible. I'll include a link in the description to his book, Assassinations, Threats in the American Presidency, along with his blog, The Progressive Professor. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Dr. Feinman. Thank you for joining us. It's great having you here.
Very happy to be here with you.
So first of all, I wanted to start by talking about the book that you wrote on presidential assassinations. I think that it's really fascinating, because it's quite a morbid subject. And I was curious, of all things, why did you want to write about presidential assassinations?
Okay, well, I think first let's show the cover of the book, which is in paperback as well as hardcover. All right. Okay. Actually, my original interest in presidential assassinations started, hard to believe, in college as a freshman. I was taking an English composition course, and I had to write a term paper as a freshman. And I chose to write about the Lincoln assassination, just by coincidence. And then the next year, the Kennedy assassination took place. And from that point on, I realized, wow, this is an interesting topic. So over the years, I did a lot of lectures locally in New York and in Florida about assassinations. And then in 2013, Roman Littlefield got in touch with me. I knew who they were, but I didn't actually have any contact with them. They contacted me at Florida Atlantic University in my email, and they said, "We noticed you're giving a lot of lectures on presidential assassinations. Would you like to write a book on it?" Wow, that was so. They pursued me. I didn't pursue them. I had retired, in quotes, from my full-time position at Broward. I was still teaching at FAU, but part-time. And in fact, just now, I just finished my second retirement. I finished my last class today, giving in the grades after another 14 years after my first retirement. So it's been 53 years I've been teaching. Anyway, so the thing is that I did that between 13 and 15, and it came out in 15, and then in paperback in 17. I had a lot of interviews, and even recently with the threats against Donald Trump, I had a few TV and radio stations contact me, including one in Australia that contacted me, a TV interview about that. So I thought I'd been forgotten because it's been years since the book came out. But I guess when it comes to assassinations, they look it up. My name shows up early on Google.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. And even just to think, like, 53 years as a history professor, that's really incredible.
And also, yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah, but even in that time, like, you witnessed a lot of assassination attempts as well, right? Like Gerald Ford would have fallen within that time.
Yes.
Reagan, right? And even Trump recently. I guess, how do you think that those assassination attempts, like, what consequence do you think that they would have had if they had gone a little bit differently as somebody who studies those?
Well, if Gerald Ford, he had 2 threats against him within 17 days in September 1975, both by women, not men, which is unusual. And indeed, the Gerald Ford Library, I went to visit Gerald Ford Museum, and they had a display, and I was there back, I guess, about 2014 or something. Well, no. I think before the book came out, maybe it was after the book came out. I don't remember. But anyway, they had a mistake. They had the wrong date for the first assassination. So I told them that's not the correct date. And they changed it and sent me an email thanking me because they had, I think, September 4th, not September 5th. And I'm very exact on these things. Okay, so in any case, if he had died, Nelson Rockefeller, who was vice president by appointment under the 25th Amendment, would have been the president. And that would have caused, I think, heart failure among conservatives in the Republican Party because they hated him. And when indeed Ford finally got the nomination for the full term in 76 against Reagan, the Reagan people made it clear before that if you're the nominee and you run with Rockefeller, we will not endorse or back you. So he picked Bob Dole instead. And then after the election was over, nothing against Bob Dole, although I don't think he really helped Ford. But after that, Ford made the statement, I probably should have kept Rockefeller on the ticket. I might have won. And I think it's possible he would have.
Oh God, that's so interesting. Even when you think about the sort of political climate around then, right? Because that's coming off of the three major assassinations in the 60s, right? JFK,
Yes.
RFK, and MLK. And then you have Vietnam with Lyndon Johnson, which caused a lot of distrust in the public, not to even mention Watergate. You eventually get Ford. I think if Ford had died, we would have, I have no idea what we would have descended into as a country. Just like the chaos of the 1960s and 70s feels like it would have really been extended even further into then,
Yeah, well, Rockefeller always wanted to be president. He tried for the nomination in 60, 64, and 68, but he was the liberal in the party, and that's the kind of person who's not found in the Republican Party right now. And I don't think that I think he would have had a real battle to be the nominee in 76 like Ford did. But if he had been president, he probably would have had the advantage. But maybe not. Maybe Reagan would have defeated him in the primary. It's one of those what ifs you never know,
No, I mean, I just think that those questions end up being really fascinating, right? Like the small things in history that make a big difference. Like a big part of what I try to do on my channel is examine the kind of personal aspects of presidential leadership, right? Because the certain points in which the person who's in the chair ends up really mattering. And I think, well, you look at something like even Lyndon Johnson's time in office after John F. Kennedy, right? Like, his passage of the Civil Rights Act was really something that Kennedy probably wouldn't have been able to get done.
I don't think Kennedy ever would have gotten it done. But I think I mentioned when you took me for the class, I don't know if he would have won re-election in 64. He was in trouble. And that's why he was campaigning in Florida and Texas, because he knew the civil rights movement was harming him in the South, because the South was George Wallace's country,
Yeah, no, JFK, I love analyzing JFK's legacy because it feels like so much of it is just defined by the assassination, right? Like, it's fascinating that JFK ends up being a sort of bipartisan figure. Like, Republicans and Democrats seem to both really look towards him and admire him. Other than the Cubans, of course. Cubans don't really seem to like him at all here in South Florida. But I think that, I don't know, JFK, all the conversations around him do kind of surround the fact that he died and like, oh, he was trying to take down the FBI and the CIA and all these things. And like, there's this sort of myth.
I go into all that in my book, the theories. I don't believe any of them. I think the Warren Commission is correct. That's just the way I see it. But there's no way to be 100% sure. There always will be doubt. And that makes people write books and make money.
Well, I wanted to explore a little bit what you think, how you think that the assassination of certain presidents did affect their legacy. Like, I know you were talking there about JFK may not have gotten reelected, but the way that we sort of venerate him today, or not even among historians, I guess, but among the general public, as one of the great presidents. And Lincoln, of course, I think would have been remembered as one of the great presidents either way. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on presidential legacy in that aspect of the assassination.
Okay, well, as far as Kennedy is concerned, I do think that Kennedy has actually gone down a little bit in rankings of scholars now. He's now often below Lyndon Johnson, which is quite surprising. In recent polls, the APSA poll, for instance, American Political Science Association poll, he's in the top 10, but he's slipped a bit. And I've always felt, yes, Kennedy's got his looks and his family and his oratory, but I think LBJ was more significant than him. And of course, he never would have been president unless Kennedy was killed, but he made a real difference. And I think maybe if Stuart Simonson, who was another competitor for the nomination in 1960 and on the short list to be the running mate and then was passed by for Johnson, he's a good man, but I'm not sure he would have been able to get the Civil Rights Act through. I'm not sure we ever would have got it through. And now look what's going on. The civil rights laws are being destroyed right now by Donald Trump. So it's really true. LBJ was path breaking. I'm not sure anyone else would have been the right person at that time, even though he's not a gorgeous guy, looks, but he really was important.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a good bit of videos of Lyndon Johnson here on the channel. He's just someone that I find personally very fascinating, and I don't think he ever could have gotten elected president in that era. It was the age of TV. JFK was really really the perfect candidate for that time. And I think Lyndon Johnson, number one, he was a master legislator, but he also got to kind of parade around John F. Kennedy's corpse, right? Be like, hey, he died. Vote for the Civil Rights Act that he was trying to pass. And that was a huge advantage for him. And I would argue that
it took him 83 days to overcome the filibuster in 1964. It was like he just got it done. He just said, we're not giving up. The longest filibuster in U.S. history, because he said, we're not giving up. And it finally got passed.
Yeah, I think Lyndon Johnson has higher highs than John F. Kennedy, but also lower lows when it comes to the Vietnam War. But I think he's an overall more.
At the Vietnam War, he'd be in the top 5.
Mm-hmm.
But as it is, he's in the top 10 near the bottom, and he's risen from what he used to be much lower. These presidents go up and down in rankings. Like I told my class, Jackson's really gone down dramatically. So has Wilson, and so has James K. Polk. Who has really risen is Eisenhower a lot, and also Grant. Now, Grant's not that high, but he used to be really low. Now he's right in the middle of the pack. Eisenhower's often rated above Truman. I'm not sure I agree with that, but he's rated, 5th or 6th, and his whole image has changed since I was a kid. And the image was he was lazy and played golf all the time, a little like Trump in that sense. Although I think Trump plays more golf than Eisenhower ever did.
Mm-hmm. See, I would love to dig deeper into that conversation there, because the three specific presidents that you mentioned, Wilson, Jackson, and
Polk.
Wilson, Jackson, and Polk. I think Wilson and Jackson in particular are ones that have sort of been reevaluated in terms of the Democratic Party, right? Like I've been working on a video about Andrew Jackson, and in researching him, there's a story about Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book about Jackson.
Advisor.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
Advisor of my other book, which I'll show now, Twilight of Progressivism, the Western Republican Senators in the New Deal. Yeah, he was my dissertation advisor. And he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1946 for The Age of Jackson.
That's incredible. I was going to ask you about this, not even knowing that. So that's amazing. So you'd have a super interesting perspective on this then, because in the Age of Jackson, he talks about, like, it was written in the contemporary period of the New Deal, right? So it's really it frames Jackson as sort of like a predecessor to Franklin Roosevelt, right? Like the New Deal is a logical continuation of Jackson's political project. And I think that's fascinating, because after the Civil Rights Movement, there is this reevaluation of Jackson for being this dreadful slave owner and for his treatment of the Native Americans. And it's sort of this transformation of what it means to be a Democrat. And and you see a lot of the same thing with Wilson, right? Like Wilson was this kind of voice of like internationalism and these these ideals of the liberal world order, but he also is someone who is terribly racist. He is a Southern apologist, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, big time.
And I'd be interested.
I tell my students, you can have a PhD. I've known people with PhDs, and I wouldn't want to vouch for them as far as their attitudes. Of course, they may know their stuff, but a lot of people with degrees often can be prejudiced too. It's not just uneducated people. So Wilson's educated, but he's a biased person. Very disturbing. And that was not covered much by Arthur Link, the big historian in the early years on Wilson. And Schlesinger really didn't deal with it. That's why now, of course, we're in a time when we're having attacks on DEI, and that's why who knows what will be seen in the future. But to me, DEI is necessary, and we do have to show all sides and not just whitewash, as like, for instance, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, likes to do when it was brought up to about Native Americans, and he said, they don't have any history. It made me furious. What kind of a person would say that and ignore Native Americans and their significance? And it's not just Ron DeSantis, it's our president and others too. They just want to make it out as if it was only white Christian America, and that just infuriates me. It really does.
Yeah, but I would love to get your perspective though on the way that the Democratic Party has evolved and the way that we regard these sort of great figures of the past, right? Like Jackson and Wilson, and the way that speaks to the sort of shifting identity of the Democratic Party, even when it comes to someone like Thomas Jefferson,
Well, a lot of it with the Democratic Party is, got to remember, the South was a dominant part of the party for a long time. It took a long time until the Northeast and Midwest started to get a lot of immigration, eventually citizens, and they became Democrats. And really, the South, once the Civil Rights Movement comes along and once the Civil Rights Act of 64 comes along, the truth is that the South goes Republican I mean, even today, most of the South now is Republican. I would argue Strom Thurmond was the first one, Senator Thurmond, who also was the oldest senator ever, 100 years old when he retired and died 6 months later, but he made it to 100. He became a Republican after the Civil Rights Act. And that's when we see a big transition where white Southerners, not everybody, of course, but a lot of them became Republicans, and they still are that way. The South, Southern Republicans are like the old Southern Democrats. And the Democrats have some Southerners, but they're mostly either Black or Hispanic or Jewish, minorities areas where they get where they're getting involved. And there aren't too many white males in the Democratic Party in the South, even in the Senate, not many. And so it's a very different time. The South has not really changed. It's just changed parties. There's still a lot of this old white supremacy that people want to ignore, but it's there. And they're getting their heyday now with Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I think with the South in particular, there is also this sort of legacy of populism, right? I think Trump plays into that in certain regards, and you yourself are mentioning it, right? The changing coalitions and the changing party systems and the way that that sort of influenced our politics. And I think that gets into your other book, The Western Republican Senators and the New Deal, and the way that the coalitions work there. Because I think we talk so much about, like Democrats really do try to usher in the legacy of the New Deal, and they talk about that a lot in their modern rhetoric, but there isn't a lot of conversations about what that coalition was and the sort of people that worked within it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, the New Deal also did not do very much on race because I guess in the mind of FDR, he couldn't directly because of the need to keep the Southern Democratic backing for his New Deal and also for the war effort. But the thing is, there were two people around him that really did promote civil rights, and he stayed quiet. His wife, Eleanor. And when he was asked about, your wife, Eleanor, was saying all these terrible things, and this, by the way, annoys me, he would laugh and say, "Can you control your wife?" So he just laughed it off that way, which is not very nice when you think about it. But that's the way men looked at women at that time in the 30s and 40s. And then Henry Wallace, the third-term vice president, who made so many enemies, he was dropped from the ticket in 44 for Truman because everybody figured Truman's safe. He hasn't said anything about race or civil rights, which is what Wallace was doing. And ended up Truman, of course, integrated the military and surprised everybody promoting civil rights. But nobody knew that, But Wallace was promoting that along with Eleanor Roosevelt, while FDR stayed out of it.
Yeah, but what about the topic of your book, though, specifically the Western Republican senators and the ways in which they aided in getting that coalition and getting that New Deal legislation passed?
Yeah, well, they were Midwesterners and Westerners who were Farm Belt, usually Republican, and they were Republican, but they were the progressive idea, populist ideas, and they therefore went along with a lot of what FDR, the opposition party leader, promoted in domestic affairs, but except for one case, George Norris, very famous senator from Nebraska, the others all were isolationists and refused to support FDR on foreign policy until, of course, Pearl Harbor. But even then, they many of them would argue that actually FDR provoked Japan, which I think is ridiculous, provoked Japan into the war. And the thing is, Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel, has revealed things I did not know when I did the research and actually got to interview two progressives back in the 1970s. Gerald Nye, one of the 12 people in my book, a Republican, and Burton Wheeler, a Democrat, but in league with these people. I got to interview both of them in their old age in the early 1970s. And I didn't realize the way she's shown it now, that these people were really apologists for Nazism and for Hitler. It didn't hit me that way from the research. And they, of course, did not tell me that when I interviewed them 25 years after the war, So it's just really interesting. It shows how we have to constantly reassess people as more information and more, more different ways of looking at things, rise up. Because really, I realized Nye and Wheeler were actually quite dangerous, and as she makes it clear. So, I mean, I think she's made a major contribution with her book Prequel, Rachel Maddow.
That's fascinating. That makes me sort of want to talk more about your experience as a historian, right? Because, what I do here on YouTube, my audience is pretty well informed. They tend to know about the subjects that we're talking about. So there's already more of a barrier to entry. But I try to be as well researched as I can be, but it's completely separate from the work of a historian, right? Like, I rely on the work that people like you do, that scholarly work, actually sitting there in the archives, talking to the people to base my work out of. And I've been kind of fascinated by that process. I've been reading Robert Caro's memoir, Working, about his process writing the Lyndon Johnson books. And I'd be curious to hear about what that was like, interviewing folks and looking through the archives and doing the research for your books.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, when I started to do research in the archives in 1970, not long ago already, 1971, in the Library of Congress, and I went out to University of California, Berkeley, and I went to Harvard University, and I went to the Kansas Historical Society, and the Minnesota Historical Society, and the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, and Columbia University, and a few other places, New York Public Library. I got so fascinated by looking at real documents, most of them, of course, handwritten, some typed, but realizing, wow. And at that point, I even thought that when I got my degree, maybe I'd try to become an archivist in the Library of Congress rather than teach. I really was thinking of that because I was just fascinated by it. It didn't work out, but I was looking into it. And then I was thinking, maybe I should be on the Senate staff. And I tried to get on George McGovern's staff, the guy who ran in 72 for president, and a few others. It didn't work out. So I ended up, teaching, which was fine, but I sort of had alternatives in my mind. The excitement of looking at real documents and handwritten and diary letters and things like that, it was just amazing. It's just absolutely, it's kind of thing. It's heady. It makes you very heady. It just makes you very happy. And then the opportunity to have interviewed, several people from the New Deal era who were still around, and they were very nice and cordial. It was really a great thing. And I didn't have a tape recorder. I just took notes, but but they just said, send me a copy of what you have and I'll see how it is. And that is another story. Gerald and I was with for 5 hours, and he treated me to lunch. And then he said, send me the notes. And he talked about everything, about FDR and everything else, of importance at the time, his involvement with the Nye Committee, his isolationist attitudes. And interestingly, I mentioned to him, I said, you've been accused, I said to him, of being an anti-Semite. I said, because I said, you did not want us to get involved in World War II. And so he said, so I said, I said to him, what do you say about that? And I don't think he knew, or maybe he did know, that I was Jewish, but I didn't tell him. But I just said, what about this? Oh, no. I still remember vividly 50 years later, Mr. Feinman, no, absolutely not. He said, I'm not an anti-Semite. He said, I sent a lot of Jewish boys to West Point from North Dakota in the 1930s. Jews in North Dakota, there were a few, but not very many in North Dakota. So I thought, oh boy, that's the answer of what the truth is. When you say that, it indicates you're a bigot.
Oh, man.
People say, some of my best friends are black. You don't say things like that. With some of my people, it's just a crazy thing to say. But I remember saying that. So, but I was cordial. I didn't say anything. And interestingly, I sent him the notes, didn't hear from him. And I wrote again, and a few months passed and didn't get an answer. And then suddenly the New York Times, he passes away 4 months later. And it turns out he went to the hospital the day after I saw him.
Oh my God.
How's that? The last person to interview him.
Oh, wow. No, that's incredible to think of, like, speaking to these historical figures firsthand. Like, what was it like in the room? Were you intimidated by him, or had you already spoken to other people at that point already?
I wasn't intimidated. I was happy he agreed to meet me, and he took me out to lunch. He was very, very outgoing and very pleasant. But just that when I asked him that question, he was vehement that he said all these Jewish boys to West Point. It just struck me as funny, but I just kept a straight face, of course. No, he was good. But Burton Wheeler, who was not one of the group, but he was a Democratic senator similar to the Republicans, I saw him in his office. He was already 89 years old. He lived another 5 years after that. But while I was there, his granddaughter was there. He had his granddaughter visiting, and she was around my age, in the mid-20s. And he was seemingly trying to set me up to go out with her. It was so funny. It was hysterical. But anyway, he didn't tell me much new, because he basically was spending his time complaining about Mayor John Lindsay, how horrible Mayor Lindsay was, the mayor of New York at the time. And I just sat there and listened. But he basically did not answer very much of information. But again, you accept whatever you get when you have an interview.
Oh yeah. Do you have any particular documents that you came across that you found were interesting, or something that sticks in your mind all these years later from your research?
Well, with Hyram Johnson, who was senator and governor of California and ran with Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 for vice president on the Progressive Moves Party line, I went out to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and read his diary letters, which were some handwritten, many of them typed, but he wrote to his sons every week for years. And I went through all these documents, and it was just fascinating, the whole way that he opened up and said a lot of things he wouldn't say in public. That's what's good about diary letters. So I thought that was very revealing. And I spent a month there in the papers, the Hyram Johnson papers at University of California, Berkeley. I just thought it was fascinating. And interestingly, that was my first time ever flying. I'd never flown before that. I got on a plane in New York, flew to San Francisco, and remember thinking, my God, a few hours ago, I was 3,000 miles away. I mean, it was like a shock to me the first time because it was new,
Mm-hmm.
So it still stands out in my mind in that way.
God, I mean, it goes to show just how much this country changed in the last 100 years, right? Like from 1900 to 2000, there really was what we call now the American century, just this rapid development and this country becoming so powerful and being a completely different place from what it was before. And I think to have been a historian in that time specifically, must have been so interesting to see the country kind of grow up along with you.
Yes.
Right. So that anecdote about the plane really strikes me.
Also, the thing that stands out is I remember before I started to teach, I was in graduate school, and I remember going on New Year's Eve, 1968, into Manhattan with a friend, and we went to see a movie that had just come out, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and this is 1968 going into 1969. I remember saying to my friend, "Can you imagine 2001?" And now we're 25 years past that. So it's like, it seems like it's even hard for me to even believe how much time has passed. And everybody that I knew that was a sports, an athlete or a singer or whatever, many of them have passed and others have not. But I say, my God, they're all old. It's like amazing when you realize how time flies, And then to think that it's 50 years next month or June that I actually got my PhD at the ceremony. So it's like, wow, what an interesting anniversary.
Yeah. And I guess building off of that, I'm really curious on your thoughts on where the work that historians do today. Because while you were talking about the letters, I was thinking about, because I've heard a lot of people discuss this, how future historians are going to struggle with studying the current time period, because there's not as many letters, there's not as many handwritten diaries and things like that. So the work of a historian is going to look very different. There's going to be people looking through social media posts and things like that don't really last as long and that might not be as open. But of course, you have Pete Hegseth texting war plans to members of the cabinet and to members of his family. So I guess there's access there, right? Yeah. But
I think certainly this president and a few others don't want us to know too much about what really happens. They're doing everything possible to make it more difficult for the long term. So it will distort the view of history, But we're always being distorted in history because there's always different angles and different ways of looking at things in different eras. So, we change our views on people as time goes by, with or without the documents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of it's memoirs of people that you have to use, but memoirs are also biased,
Yes. I mean, but what do you think of, as history sort of evolves, I guess, because I'm someone who became very interested in history because of things I saw on the internet, right? So when I think back on how someone like your age would have gone into history back in the day, it feels a lot harder to conceive of. And you have people like myself that, like I said, aren't historians, right? Like I do not do the same level of research that a historian does, that I do try to do my best, people that are speaking about history and speaking about politics that don't necessarily have the same credentials. And in a lot of ways, it's good because it lets you get the message out there. It lets you sort of try to create history in an entertaining way, but you also have people that are talking about it with inaccuracies. There's echo chambers. There's people that just reaffirm certain kinds of worldviews, and going as far back as like yellow journalism back in the 1900s, right? With the democratization of media in general. Yeah, like there's always distortions when a voice is given to people that didn't really have a voice before. So I guess I'd be interested in examining your thinking on how that impacted history in the past, perhaps the sort of perspectives building, and how you think that'll go today.
Well, I think for a long time in the past, history was very one-sided. Even when I was in college, Reconstruction was an era that was really first being reviewed after a century of white supremacy domination and not understanding the truth of Reconstruction after the Civil War. It was stunning to me when in the 60s, we started to realize in high school, I learned one thing and it was a very one-sided thing. And then suddenly it changed. I think, also the role of Native Americans. My oldest son works for the Conservation Lands Foundation and really knows a lot about Native Americans and all about the conservation and the environment. And he knows more than I do. And the point is that basically the history of Native Americans was always totally ignored. And Black America, we knew they were there, but it didn't really look at them in the same way. And even immigrant groups were ignored for a long time. Everything has changed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and since. And it's really, it's stunning when you think of how differently things were looked at when I was in college or even in high school, really how much it's changed. And it continues to change, but I'm concerned that now with the distortions that are being promoted by this new administration, we're going to have a lot of the past, wiped out, the records wiped out or somehow put to the side. It's going to be a big battle to get back to the situation we were in before this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even then, that's something I tend to struggle with a bit, and even and a lot of the work that I've done this year has sort of surrounded Manifest Destiny and this idea of what that represents in the American cultural canon, so to speak. In the American mind, there is the spirit of exploration, this idea that we were pioneers and we expanded, but there is also the dark history of that, the pain that was caused, to the Native Americans, the way that this country in a lot of ways was built on slavery, like we wouldn't have been nearly as prosperous without it. And I think that's a sort of contradiction that you tend to run into, right? Because I think you see that pioneer spirit being used in a lot of positive ways. Like you think of Kennedy and the New Frontier, right? And even the historian, oh my God, who that wrote about the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, he sort of lamented the closure of the frontier, right? He was like, man, the American people aren't going to have something to strive for anymore in the same way. And I guess trying to reconcile the sort of romanticized version of this country. And I think that's something that the left and liberals in general can kind of struggle with a little bit, right? Because it is like a kind of fundamental reckoning with the hardships that this country has created, the sort of sins of the United States. But it's something that I think if you look on the side of the conservatives, I think they can kind of try to just push that aside completely and to say, no, we're just the greatest country in the world and we're not going to reckon with this past at all. And I'd just be curious your thoughts on that sort of a dichotomy.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Germany, since the time of Nazism, has come to grips with reality and does not try to whitewash Nazism. And we're having people want to try to do it, but we cannot allow, and I'm vehement on that, to whitewash history. And that's why even Frederick Jackson Turner, he talked about the frontier, but he didn't seem to care much about Native Americans. Even now, when I mention in class about Polk and about the Mexican War, I point out half of Mexico pretty much was taken away, by us. So I said, is there any wonder why people in Mexico may not be thrilled about us all the time? Because if you lost half your country, would you be happy? Try to show a different perspective, because people don't think about it that way. They say, all those, people say, all those Mexicans coming across the border. That is their country. That's where they were. They were there before the so-called white Christians came in and took it over, as far as in the time of Texas, it's just amazing how how so much whitewashing goes on. But in my class, as I think you remember, I never whitewashed anything. I gave the whole story.
Did you ever come into any conflict there with the way that history has been talked about in universities now, with talking about race and issues like that? Did that ever present a problem to you in your position?
No, because nobody in the history department or the political science department ever interfered and told me what to say or what to teach. And that is one thing that, however, concerns me now. If I was a young person or middle age and I was teaching, let's say, high school social studies, it would be really difficult because there's all kinds of restrictions now. People are going to lose their jobs if they don't follow the lead. And I don't know if I'm just glad I don't have to deal with that. The one good thing I'm glad about being my age. The only thing, I don't have to deal with this anymore. And that's why I decided this was, after 53 years, it's the time to retire. Except for lectures. I still do lectures, but in lectures, it's a specific topic. I don't go off on tangents, But the only thing I do is that in my blog, theprogressiveprofessor.com, which I've done since 2008, daily.
I guess another thing that I wanted to ask you is, what do you think you have learned after 53 years as an American history and politics professor? What do you think your main takeaways are from such a long career?
I guess I'd say I'm humbled about how little I know. How's that? That there's so much more to learn, and I'm the perfectionist, and I know I'm never going to be perfect, but I always feel like I could improve. So even in a class, if I stumble on a word, it annoys me, because anybody can stumble on a word. Or once in a while, when somebody is asked and I don't know the answer, I don't just dismiss it. I say, I'll look it up. And I look it up, and I come back to the next class and tell them. But honestly, no matter how much one knows, no matter how many different interpretations you have, I don't claim to have the final answer on anything. I have an open mind, and I certainly encourage as much as possible students to interact. Some do and some don't. I remember you did, and that was great, but not always true in every class. But I mean, I just think that it's still a job to keep the history of the country and the civilization we have, and to make sure that people understand the true story, not a sanitized story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're in a classroom, something that particularly struck me about your class was that I sort of felt your excitement, right? I felt your passion, that this was something that you genuinely wanted to talk about. And I had never taken a class just straight up about the American presidency before. So to have one that closely examined a subject that I was interested in, taught by someone who seemed like genuinely very invested and very knowledgeable about it, was something that I think very special. Like, your class was one of my favorites that I took in college, and that's why I'm talking to you today. I do think that you have a lot of valuable knowledge to pass on, and a lot of like my earlier videos, especially, the scripts were based off of projects that I did in your class.
Oh wow, that's
which which helped a lot, because those were already pre-written. And I think that I don't know, people. I sort of think of how people struggle to engage in college sometimes, right? Like, people a lot of the time don't know what they're really going to school for. It feels like they're just they're just being in school because it's the logical thing to do. So I think that when people can sort of see like a genuine passion and a genuine like excitement to talk about a subject coming from the person that they're learning from, that always is a plus.
Well, I've always had a passion, and I guess I should tell you, when did it start? When I was 10 years old, 10 years of age. I lived in an apartment building in New York in Nassau County, and my father went out to put the garbage down the chute on the third floor of the building. And on the other side was a book there, a hardcover book on the ground. Apparently that person in that other apartment was getting rid of the book, but didn't throw it down the chute. He left it out there, and my father brought it in, and he said, Ronnie, he said, I think you might like this. Boy, did that change my life. The American Past by Roger Butterfield, 1947 publication. This was in 1955 that I got the book from my father, and it had photographs and cartoons and text about American history and a lot of it about presidents. And wow, that got me so excited. And from that point on, now for 70 years, I've been what a radio show host, who I don't speak to anymore right now, but I did for years, called me, he gave me a name, which is not a real word, but I love it. He said, "You're a presidentologist." Like psychologist, a sociologist. It's the presidential scholar is what it is, but he calls it a presidentologist. And I think it's a funny word. And I even tried to see if I could arrange for that to be a word in the dictionary. I never got an answer back, but I think it's a good word. Presidentologist, they're combined. That's my passion all these years. And a lot of what I write on my blog is related to that, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think presidents, I'm someone who definitely, my channel isn't supposed to be exclusively about history or exclusively about presidents, but it's a topic I just always come back to. I think in my personal experience, I originally wanted to be a film director. Wow. That was like my first great passion, and I was always very
you might be still.
Yeah, true. But I was always very character oriented. It was always the thing that fascinated me the most. And in learning about the presidency and about history, that I really wanted to know more about these individuals, to think what it feels like to be the person in that chair, to be in a lot of cases the most powerful person on the planet. At least for the last 80 years or so. What does that feel like? And that was always something that compelled me a lot. And I think that the presidency is really interesting to examine for that reason, because of the, that specific experience that those individuals have. And usually they're very fascinating people, right? You look at a Lyndon Johnson, a Richard Nixon, and you look at the psychology of those people, and it's just otherworldly, right? And I think that, honestly, that's something I try to do a lot in my work, is talk about those aspects that might be interesting to a broader public. Like the best compliment I like to hear is when I mention a book and someone says that it made them check it out, that they read a book that I referenced in my work, because I was like, oh, okay, that's another person that picked up a book just like you did, whose interest might be piqued. And I think that if you can bring people in on the character analysis, like I do, I think that it can sort of spread that knowledge to someone who might not have come across it otherwise, right? Like, I became a fan of history because I liked the musical Hamilton when I was like 15. So like that sort of barely missed me. Like it could have been that I didn't become a history fan. So I'm always interested in finding out the ways that people discovered it, and I think that that's something that we also have to keep in mind. And it's sort of why a position like mine is also important. Like, you have historians that do their work, but there is a higher barrier to entry, right? Like, if you're a guy on YouTube standing in front of a background and sort of just talking, it's very accessible to people in a way that the work that a historian does may not be.
Yeah, I want to mention also, by the way, just to let you know, that I also give lectures to senior citizens and other groups, and I have all kinds of PowerPoints. I have PowerPoints on personal lives of America's presidents outside of the presidency itself, the retirement of presidents, different presidents who had a retirement career after retirement, a group of them. First ladies have done PowerPoints on those too. I also talk about the interaction of Lincoln with 5 former presidents in the Civil War crisis. So I interact all of the ones who were alive at the time. So I have all kinds of PowerPoints and all kinds of presentations. And so it's not just about being in the White House, it's beyond that, much more. I also want to... I'm sorry. What?
Oh, no, you can go ahead.
Okay, I also wanted to say that also interesting and not enough attention given to is study the presidential losers, the ones who don't win. And some of them are really impressive people. Like Al Gore was just the other day on Bill Maher, and it was 25 years after he ran. He's 77, and he looks great. And they even joked about maybe he'll run again. He's a little older, but he looks great. He looks like he's totally alert. But I mean, Al Gore is fascinating. Adlai Stevenson's fascinating. Thomas E. Dewey, so many others. The people who don't win, and then the case of some people who don't win, and it's good they don't win. Like, I give the example I may have said in your class that when Abraham Lincoln's elected, one of the people running against him is Stephen Douglas, who's very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. He dies 6 months later in July 1861. So if he had become president, he would have died after 4 months. So the what ifs of history are also fascinating,
Yeah, there's a an excellent book I read. I'm pretty sure it's by Scott Ferris, called Almost Presidents, that just goes through almost every single loser of a general election in American history. It's one of my favorite history books that I've ever read, and it taught me a lot about figures who I wasn't super knowledgeable about. William Jennings Bryan's a big one that I still need to do a lot of research on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually also 3 times.
Mm-hmm. No, Henry Clay is another super.
I'm a big Henry Clay fan. Not so much on Bryan personally.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Clay was the best person who never got elected president, I'd say. And then he was a slave owner, so I see the faults, but I see him also as a real statesman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think Henry Clay in particular, I've encountered him again in my research about Jackson, and the sort of, them serving as kind of foils to each other, like these two frontiersmen politicians, and the different visions for what that could be like. And even just like going back to our conversations about the frontier, it's interesting how that's kind of played into the perception of candidates also, right? Like Andrew Jackson was the first. I only recently realized that he was the first president elected who wasn't from Virginia or Massachusetts, and I thought that was insane. That had not occurred to me, and how big of an actual departure that was, and the way that
person not born to wealth.
Mm-hmm.
He became wealthy, but he was not born to wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And the others all were aristocrats.
That's the irony of Jackson too, right? Is he becomes an aristocrat. He becomes an elite. This very thing that he's deriding. He's a lot like Trump in that way. Actually, the sort of type of populism that he plays. What do you make of the recent? I actually have a video about this coming out this week, but the recent Trump pivot towards McKinley and sort of talking about McKinley's legacy and that sort of a dawn of the American empire in a way.
Well, I say that I missed who you're talking about. Say that again. I'm sorry.
Oh, Trump's recent sort of interest in William McKinley and the dawn of the American empire.
You said McKinley. Well, he's a big Jackson fan and a McKinley fan because he thinks about the McKinley tariff, which McKinley promoted as a member of Congress in 1890, which helped to lead to the Panic of 1893. So he doesn't understand tariffs, and what he's doing to us now is a real tragedy, because the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, Herbert Hoover was smart, but he did not listen to economists, hundreds of them in the New York Times ad that said, do not sign this tariff. It'll make things worse. The economy in the world was going down. He signed it, and we had the Great Depression, got much worse. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, but he likes Jackson because Jackson's the kind of a guy who's combative like he is. So he likes to see himself as being like Jackson. I'm talking about Trump likes to see himself as being like Jackson, but Jackson's rating has been going down, and McKinley's is so-so, not great. But he probably thinks they're the greatest with his lack of knowledge.
I think with Andrew Jackson in particular, there is also that sort of legacy of appealing to the common man, right? Like being brash in a way that politicians generally aren't, and being kind of unconventional in that way. And I think Trump is also sort of fascinated by military figures. So Jackson's another hero.
He served the military and got drafted. That's the irony of it.
And even with McKinley, it seems that, like there is this kind of romantic notion of American expansion that we've been talking about, of growing the country's borders. And I'd be lying if I said that there wasn't a sort of like appeal to the idea of the country getting bigger on a map that I think people would be kind of fond of, even if you look at the sort of conversations about like taking over Canada and Greenland and all these things as kind of unserious. I think he respects McKinley for that kind of like version of the United States that's just kind of a pirate going over and taking over foreign land,
However, the stories about McKinley, if you remember, he was not actually that anxious to take us into war against Spain. He had to have God intervene to tell him to do it. That's the story, that he had trouble sleeping, and God came to him in the middle of the night, called him Bill, not Mr. President, and said, you have to help your poor little brown brothers in Cuba. What a racist term, poor little brown brothers. So I don't think he was quite as keen. I think he was pulled into the war by people like Theodore Roosevelt and others who were gung-ho to go to war, and he was, of course, an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then he went off and formed his Rough Riders, went into Cuba, and bragged more than he did anything else about what he accomplished there. It was certainly exaggeration. In fact, I've compared Trump to EOS, saying they're both outspoken braggarts. They really are. Now, TR has a lot of positives, but I'm just saying that he's very much boastful and he's a character. And I think that they have that commonality, that they're both outspoken and you can never stop thinking about them because they're always in your face all the time. TR, right to the end of his life, was doing that. He was always speaking out and writing and all that, and being active and going off even to Africa on a safari, and all that, and going to the Amazon River Basin. Dangerous things for a man who was overweight.
Yeah, I mean, even with Theodore, I think the perfect quote for Theodore Roosevelt is the one said by his daughter Alice, that my father had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Right, he wanted to be the center of attention. I think that kind of informs his politics also, right? Because prior to him, the president was very different office. It wasn't super present in the daily lives of the American people. And I think Theodore Roosevelt really made sure that he was there. And he was very interventionalist, not only in his foreign policy, but in his domestic policy as well. He just wanted the president to be the sort of main character figure in a way that they hadn't been prior. And I think that Trump is also kind of that way too. He does want to be the topic of conversation. He likes seeing the other foreign leaders of the world having to play to the United States, and he likes the fact that he's always in the news, right? Like the worst thing we could do to Trump is just not talk about him.
You're right. And the thing is, TR did revolutionize the presidency, and now I think, for good or for bad, I think Trump has gone beyond Franklin D. Roosevelt's first 100 days. I think as far as accomplishments, whether you like them or not, but he's done more than even FDR, who always was the standard that we went by. And I wanted to mention Alex Roosevelt Longworth, that I did a lecture just last week on famous and accomplished presidential offspring, talking about sons and daughters of presidents who became significant. And there's two daughters, Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret Truman Daniel, and Alex Roosevelt Longworth, TR's daughter. And then there's 7 sons, which include George W. Bush and, of course, John Quincy Adams as 2 of them. Sons of presidents, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Donald Trump's first 100 days, the thing that I go back to, though, is that there's not really legislative accomplishments. Like there's been a lot of action, but it's been executive action, which is also really fascinating because it's like nothing is codified in law. It's things that the next administration could just come in and take over completely. And it's funny because
it could also intervene.
Well, but you look at, like there's a lot of conversation about like the unitary executive theory and the idea of the president more so. Did you see Bukele in El Salvador? His Twitter bio says philosopher king, which is extraordinary that a modern head of state would declare themselves that. And I think that really is the sort of approach that they're taking, is just executive action, which means that the 100 days, it feels impactful, but I'm not sure if it's going to be a lasting impact, so to speak.
I agree. I don't think it will be. I think a lot of it, just like a lot of what Trump did in the first term, was reversed by Joe Biden by executive order. So I think its executive orders have become a joke because there's too many of them, and a lot of them end up not being long lasting. I think it's overused by all presidents in recent times. It's very rare to have used it, but now the last few presidents have used it an awful lot, including Joe Biden and Barack Obama. They certainly did use it quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to the conversation about party systems, it feels like we are just at a certain turning point, right? Like it feels like the coalitions are changing a little bit. The Democratic Party has sort of become the party more so of the like upper middle class, professional class type people, as the Republicans have kind of become more a party of the working class, which is also funny because that's not what a lot of Democrats want the party to be. They do want the Democrats to be the party of the working class, of the common man, as it has been historically. How do you think that the party shifting is going to impact our politics in the way that we study this period? Okay,
well, I think the tariffs, if they really become as horrible as they seem like they will be, will make many working class people go back to the Democrats. And even if they flirted with the Republicans for now. I've actually argued for a while that the Republican Party, as we know it, is no longer the Republican Party. It's not a traditional conservative party. It's the Trump Party. And there are a lot of conservatives who are not in government, who are not in elected office, who have condemned Trump before in his first term and now again. It's not as if it's a rare thing. And even Wall Street Journal, often is critical, even though it's controlled by the same family that controls Fox News Channel. And I do think that I've actually advocated for what we need to do, and you might find this funny, is the Republican Party should, if I had my way, disappear and come back as the Whig Party. The Whig Party of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, and John Quincy Adams. Good people. Not them, but people like that.
Yeah, I mean,
help with the Republicans, I think we need to reverse it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating the way that parties transform, and I think that every day we are living through history to a certain extent. And I guess just if you have any sort of closing thoughts, I'll finish off with the question of well, what would your word of advice be to a young person who is interested in history and politics and studying these things as someone with so much experience?
Okay, I would say that if you find history fascinating and you want to pursue it, do so. If you can make a career out of it as an historian or as a person who works in the Library of Congress or does videos like you do, fine. But if not, it's a great background, even to go to law school or go for an MBA. It's a good, solid background, and it makes you a better person socially because then you know what's going on in the world, which too many people don't know. So it may not be seen as practical by everybody, but I think that it is something that's very important field that we need to not let people forget about or underestimate. I think history and politics are things that we all need to be much more engaged in.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Feinman, for coming on. We got to get going, but I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on, and I'd love to have you back on sometime.
Okay, anytime. Just let me know. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.